I want to begin the reconvening of our discussion today just with a few reflections from the dialogue that happened before lunch. At a really basic level, Kate's insight about the use of our language got right down to a really core aspect of this graph. Which is a very basic overview of the legal family of the country that we call Canada, the nation state that we call Canada. So this is just a very basic introduction, and Kate's insight got right to the heart of Indigenous peoples across this country perspectives about treaty making, as was described briefly in my reference to Elder Don Sampson's speech about the Douglas treaties yesterday afternoon. That's a common. I had guests from Treaty 9 territory in northern Ontario come down to Clayoquot in 2013, and they orated the story of Treaty 9 from their perspective, and these basic dynamics are all the same. The Creator, the European nation, and the Indigenous nation come together in relationship. The Creator bears witness and authorizes that relationship. Very similar to the basic principles of marriage. Go into a church and say your wedding vows and have your families and call upon whichever God or Creator that you hold dear to your life and ask for that guidance in your marriage. The coming together of nations in Canada is a very strong and beautiful story. The early treaties weren't made with lawyers and consultants gathering around mounds of paper. They were literally month-long festivals of relationship where children were exchanged. Men and women were married. And those international agreements became the constitutional foundation of the state. And that is something that still drives everything that's happening in this country. The judiciary didn't wake up one day and say, wow, those Indians are not so bad. There's been all of those victories at the Supreme Court of Canada because the judiciary is actually following the law of the country, not the bylaws that prohibited our friend here from getting a trout. They're talking about this higher level of legal authority, which is at the constitutional level. In a really quick nutshell, the reason why there was this positive relationship is because during the 7 Years' War in the 1750s, King George relied very heavily upon his international relationships with the Iroquois Confederacy. And in fact, King George relied heavily on the Iroquois as military allies during the 7 Years' War with the French, which is why I speak English to you and not French. There was a colonial war in the 1750s, the 7 Years' War. King George profited greatly from his treaty relationship with the Iroquois Confederacy. They had in place a vast and sophisticated network of international relationships with tribes as far west as the Great Plains. There are Sioux Nation warriors who had come to fight alongside the Iroquois in support of King George. So when that war was won by the British, King George issued his Royal Proclamation of 1763. And that Royal Proclamation of 1763 is still the legal premise upon which we are negotiating modern-day treaties today. People hear about the Royal Proclamation of 1763 all the time. What's often left out of that period of history is that immediately following his proclamation, which had to be literally written out and by overland courier, the words of King George were taken to each of those nations, many, many nations who had come together in the war effort against the French. And the words of his proclamation were brought to those peoples as an extension of chivalry and as an invitation to make treaty. So following the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was one of the largest gatherings of nations in the history of North America at a place called Fort Niagara, which is what today is known as Ontario. And the treaty at Fort Niagara was made in 1764 with the creation of a wampum belt. It was many months long celebration of relationship, very similar to this, peoples of different backgrounds coming together and making a decision to work together and live together. And what that wampum belt said was, we now have a shared destiny. We have a shared future. But we will make a promise to live in parallel sovereignty with one another. And this became essentially a foundation of collective security. That if you, my brother, are ever in trouble, I will come to your defense. And King George was the little brother in that relationship. It was not long after that the American Revolutionary War proceeded, and when the Loyalists fled north and receded into their treaty relationships with the stronger nations of the north, who were more populous and more in control of their rivers and lakes, King George had to call again in the War of 1812 on his treaty relationship with the Iroquois Confederacy, and the elder brother came again to the assistance of the younger brother. That's what this constitutional relationship is about, and that's why Indigenous peoples in this country keep winning when it goes to court. In British Columbia, the geopolitical context is slightly different, simply because of two things: a time difference. When they were signing off on the Quebec Act in the 1770s, first contact was happening on Vancouver Island. There's a vast time space between first contact in 1492, first contact here in 1778, I believe it was, when Cook came to Friendly Cove. The second thing that makes British Columbia different is that the Rocky Mountains created a physical barrier between the Dominion of Canada and the colonies of Vancouver Island and New Caledonia. At that time, this international relationship created the potential for domestic law. The first potential for domestic law in this part of the world, in terms of British common law, was the British North American Act of 1867. It said a lot, about good governance and all the rest of it, but in terms of the structuring of the legal family of Canada, the important sections are Section 91, which created federal jurisdiction, and Section 92, which created provincial jurisdiction. Section 92 created provincial authority, and then from that provincial authority, municipal law was delegated. So that's an important distinction between constitutional law and constitutionally protected and specified jurisdiction between the federal and provincial governments, and delegated authority to municipal and regional government. Our friend who ran up against private land was dealing with policy in this area here. His right and responsibility to maintain relationship with fish and other species in the ecosystem are part of constitutional law in this country. The thing that Kate got to very quickly is that there actually was a lot of talk of God and spirituality and the sacred during the negotiations of the original treaties and the coming together of nations. Clearly, things have changed quite a bit since the British North American Act of 1867. We had the creation of new provinces that came on board, like British Columbia in 1871. But this is, in a nutshell, the story of the division of authority in this country. It's a very dynamic body of law because of its very slow and gradual development. It wasn't like in the United States where there was a Revolutionary War and the creation of a new country and a new constitution. It took us until 1982 to fully patriate our constitution with the creation of the Canada Act of 1982. So up until 1982, all amendments to our constitution had to first go to the Privy Council in London before being ultimately ratified. In 1982, a domestic amending formula for our own constitution was adopted. And what also came about in 1982 was the creation of something called Section 35, the recognition and affirmation of existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. And it's important to note in that Section 35 is that the policymakers were not creating something new. What they were doing was ensuring that this long history was not forgotten, and that this long history would continue to be honored. Which is why, as I said earlier, throughout the court systems, there's been victory after victory after victory. By far, the lion's share of court battles have been going in the favor of the Indigenous peoples. Most Indigenous peoples I talk to will tell you right off the bat, we are tired of going to court. I had I've been adopted by a family in the Chilcotin, and I got to hear firsthand the stories about that 25-year legal battle for the precedent-setting court case in June of 2014. They had their elders spend the last decades of their lives in court instead of being with their grandchildren. They spent the last quarter century of their lives in conflict. Imagine the indignity of somebody coming in and saying, "Who are you? Prove it to me." You have to prove to me, even though I'm the newcomer in your house, you have to prove to me who you are and how long you've been here. That's what the court case is about strength of claim. They went through that process. Communities don't want to be stuck in court for decades on end. By and large, people want to live peaceful lives with their families. And that's what is so beautiful and inspiring about this process. If it's a genuine process, and if you're not just talking about reconciliation, that you're actually willing to commit to reconciliation, then we don't have to continue to live out the court dramas. We can actually start to work together, not samat, one heart and one mind, to create our shared vision. So it's a great opportunity, and there's a lot of different levels, but this is the nutshell overview. And when you talk to elders from communities right across this nation, there's not the grasping of authority that one might expect to say, we're the boss. We have the biggest hammer. By and large, this type of authority for Indigenous peoples is lived as a grandmother's responsibility. And when a grandmother sees that her children are not making decisions which are in the best interests of her grandchildren, it is natural law in many of our societies that a grandmother or a grandfather literally has the rightful jurisdiction in the family to step in and intervene with a firm but loving hand. And I think that's, in the majority of my experience, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing Indigenous peoples stepping in with a firm but loving hand to say, hey, enough is enough. We've got to draw the line somewhere. There's not going to be anything left for the future generations. Or we have to weigh on the side of caution. When you have the well-being of children under your responsibility, we always have to weigh on the side of caution if we're not absolutely sure what the outcome is going to be. And so these are some of the thoughts that I would like to put forward. The interesting thing about this chart is that it opens a conversation about identity and legal capacity. If you go to Manitoba and listen to the Manitoba Chiefs and the province of Manitoba have come together and who've talked about this relationship. And they've created public education campaigns. The image of brown children and white children playing together at a schoolyard setting. And the caption is, "We are all treaty people." And it's true. Every citizen of this country has treaty rights and responsibilities. As Don Sampson said, the initial relationship is between the Creator and the people, and the Douglas Treaties were a mechanism to share what they had from the Creator with the newcomers. And in the sharing of those resources, there's also a sharing of responsibility. So what I would say from the elders I've spoken with across this country is just to reiterate that we are all treaty people. The difference being is that on one side of the relationship, there's been a continual chain of knowledge about what those treaty rights and responsibilities are. I met William Commanda before he passed away, who was one of the last formally trained wampum belt carriers. They carry these wampums from those early treaties. And he spoke to me about the curriculum that went along with those artifacts. There's a continual chain of knowledge exchange on one side. And on the other side, we're just kind of waking up. And this dialogue about reconciliation, I think, is an opportunity for us to collectively revisit this powerful story of social innovation.